So before we begin today, I want to acknowledge the university's origin in a land grant from the Anishinaabe and Wyandot bands. We further acknowledge that the university stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands obtained and generally in unconstitutional ways from indigenous people. In addition to our research on the ecology and evolutionary biology of Michigan, has benefited from and continues to benefit from access to land originally gained through the exploitation of others. So today, it is my absolute honor and pleasure and privilege to introduce Katie Stuble, who is a research scientist and department director at Holden Arboretum. Katie holds faculty appointments at both Case Western University and Kent State University, in addition to her position at Holden. She received her bachelor's degree from St. Mary's College in Maryland in 2004, and her master's from the University of Georgia in 2008, where she focused her work on ants and fire ants in particular. Her PhD was from the University of Tennessee in 2013, where she explored how warming impacts ant activity. I have been following Katie's work since she was a master's student, and she went on to go on and do her postdoctoral fellowships in Oklahoma and the University of California, which is particularly notable because she moved from working exclusively on ants, which are fascinating and fun, to working on soils and plants, which clearly which is clearly such an amazing area of research. So I think that Katie is unique in her research program because she works across a lot of different taxa, exploring multiple different levels of ecological questions from very local scale to more regional scale. She's been incorporating thinking about management, land management, in terms of restoration, in particular of forest systems, with a climate change lens, which I think is unusual in a lot of the management research that we see coming out. She has published countless papers, well over 30, in prestigious journals such as Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, Global Change Biology, and Ecology monographs. In addition to being an absolute fantastic researcher, she's also an extraordinary collaborator, I know, because I've had the privilege of collaborating with her, mentor and leader. I just want to say that Katie's terrific. She's an amazing female leader in ecology. She's one of the people that I turn to regularly for advice on thinking about negotiating ecology and thinking about how we can train and mentor better students, or our students better. And she's a tremendous scientist, and I'm excited to be able to have you here today. I think that inviting you as the first person I got to invite to Michigan, is such a privilege that you said yes and decided to come. I'm so excited you're here. Anyway, thank you. And with that, you're going to be talking about assembling communities in a changing world, how changing climates and invading species are reshaping our ecosystems.
Thanks so much. So this is totally a day of firsts. AMA's first in-person seminar, my first in-person seminar in eons, two years since pre-pandemic times. So this is quite an honor, and also what a delightful group to come spend my first in-person seminar with. You guys are so bright, and there are a million of you that I think I'm going to email and get you to help me with my research. You guys are so smart and gave me so many good things to think about. So I'm going to talk today, as Amy said, a little bit about my research into thinking about assembly of natural systems in the context of warming and non-native species, and in particular thinking about how we go about doing restoration in systems that are sort of facing this brave new world. Before I do that, some bait and switch, I'm going to talk a little bit about my job, in part because I think that the folks here that are still in early stages of their career trajectory, I think you guys in this space have a really good sense of what a faculty job might look like, but you don't have such a good sense about the myriad of options that are out there, and especially jobs that are based in the museum world, and in particular, the world of living museum specimens. And so this is a shot of the Holden Arboretum. This is where I work. We are about 20 to 30 miles outside of the city of Cleveland in Ohio, and we are a certified museum. So you guys think about museums having collections of things. It's what makes a museum a museum. So we think about art museum. They have collections, of course, of art. There are natural history museums. They have collections of things like dead birds and fossils. And we have this giant collection of living things. And in particular, we're specializing in woody plants, though we have a lot of herbaceous plants too. especially since we've merged with the Cleveland Botanical Garden. And so about half of the staff in our research department really focuses on our collections. They do collections-based science. We can think about this as a huge common garden. So we have individuals and species from around the globe, and they're all growing in this common climate in the greater Cleveland area. And so we have a world-class rhododendron collection that one of my colleagues uses to think about things like water transport and what sorts of traits make plants able to sort of cope with different sorts of conditions. One of my colleagues works on our really extensive crabapple collection, and she looks at microbiome and disease resistance. We have folks that are breeding new species or new cultivars that are going to be more resistant to common pathogens. And so we have folks that are really capitalizing on this section of what museum means. At the Holden Arboretum, we have about 700 acres of manicured gardens and collections. We have about 3,000 acres of natural areas. And so me as a community ecologist and a restoration ecologist, this is really my bread and butter. This is not really unique in the museum world. So we at the Holden Arboretum are one of the largest arboreta spatially because we have this big natural area that we manage, but there's lots of museums that are managing large natural areas. So our sister institution in the Cleveland area is the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. They have tens of thousands of acres, so they have an urban campus. You can go and visit and see, the mammals and the gems. But in the greater area of Northeast Ohio, they have all these different sorts of land holdings, and they have folks that are working exclusively in those areas. They're managing them, and they're also doing research. Smithsonian is known for having large land holdings that they're doing extensive research on. And so at Holden, about half of the research team is working in these spaces. And for us, this is ranging from old growth forest to old fields to wetlands and sort of everything in between. And my job path, which Amy just outlined, which I should have foreseen, but I'm now showing you in pictorial sort of depiction, is circuitous and probably similar to the path lots of you guys are on. So I started out doing a master's degree in Georgia in longleaf pine savannas, where I looked at ant-mediated seed dispersal, moved north to Tennessee for a PhD where I studied ant communities in longleaf pine, or not longleaf pine, in deciduous forests. In sort of the middle of the country, postdoced at the University of Oklahoma in mixed grass prairies where I started doing plants and community assembly, and then all the way to the West Coast where I studied assembly again in California grasslands, but now through a much more applied restoration lens. And then I ended up in Ohio, and this was not a position I ever expected to be in. I didn't see myself as a museum scientist, and certainly not at what is ostensibly a museum of trees, right? My background was in grasslands and ants, and the Arboretum was looking for a community ecologist. I figured that must involve trees. Turns out, no. They were quite flexible. If my organisms existed among the trees, that was good enough for them. So I ended up in the museum world. Here is where I exist on the earth in my office. So this is the Long Science Center, and we are sort of a smallish department, but we have pretty good resources for a researcher. So you can see we are right adjacent to our greenhouse facilities, and then a pretty big grow facility. We share this with our collections folks. So we have polyhouses and lath houses, and we can grow all sorts of research plants along with the collection plants they're growing. Our collections and manicured gardens are more like over here, and then behind us and then all around these are our natural areas. These are our forests. And I'll say this is one of the big boons for me as a field ecologist, is that here I am in Long Science, and like I walk down this like a little path, and in 15 minutes I am in my long-term phenology plots, which is really nice for being able to sort of accelerate the trajectory of, how frequently I can look at those, how many volunteers I can send out to. They're really close and convenient, which is nice. So my job is in some ways a lot like a faculty job, and in some ways it's very different from a faculty job. So this is what my crew looks like sometimes in the year. So it's sort of ebbs and flows depending on the season. I have a technician in my lab full time. I have a PhD student and a master's student. And then in the summer we have lots of interns and other folks that are helping us out with research. If we were being really technical about my job, and several of you guys have asked me about this, so I'll say it out loud to everybody. In paper, when they hired me, my split is 80-20. So my job is 80% research, and it's 20% other stuff. And that includes service to Holden Forest and Gardens, and it includes education. And that education component, instead of faculty at a university that might be lecturing students in a classroom, ours is sort of a whole gamut of things. So sometimes I might be at an event at the Arboretum and interacting with preschool kids. Sometimes I might be at a workshop that we're doing, engaging with landowners about best practices in forest management. We also have a pretty extensive internship program every summer, so we bring in students from around the country that are going to come and do research in our various labs, forests, collections in the summer. So if any of you guys might want to get a peek at what this sort of world looks like, know that we are usually advertising these in about December, and we're making hires in about February. And it's not just us in research department. We have internships that are in our collections department, our conservation department, and on, education. One of the things that's a little bit different is instead of having amazing undergraduates that help me with doing research, monitoring phenology, collecting samples, processing samples, we're a little too far out from the universities that I'm adjunct at to have those folks come out. And so instead I have these folks. These are my volunteers. They tend to be retirees because they have time during the day, and they come out and they help me do all sorts of sample processing. And it's a great way to sort of teach people about climate change and plants and what's happening in the world. The other thing I really like about my job is that the Arboretum has a great conservation department, and those guys are tasked with managing our 3,000 acres. And for me, that's great because they are doing so much heavy lifting out in the field. So this is someone, she's removing tons of multiflora rows, and so they're doing all this legwork, and I can be like, hey, if we want to quantify that, you can leave me some controls and make some replicates, and we can get numbers on that, right? So I can harness the power of what they do. I also have the ability to, when I do applied work, nest that in a more realistic framework. So a practitioner in our conservation department might say, Katie, they are not going to remove these non-native species for 10 years. Not going to happen. We will go out for 3 years. And I say, okay, that's what a practitioner will do. A practitioner would spend 3 years removing these non-natives. Let's do that. Let's measure what that does with our trees. And so they sort of let me have a more realistic framework for some of what we're doing. And so what are we doing? So we're going out in our forest and sort of trying to understand how species are interacting with one another, what our forests look like now, what they look like in the past, what we think they might look like in the future, and how we might be able to use restoration practices to sort of push them in directions we'd like to see them go. And so when we think about our communities, so here we're looking at one of our old fields at the Arboretum, and thinking about really basic questions people have always asked in ecology. Why does this old field look the way it does? What species coexist? Why are some species here and some species are not? And we know that, in part, what we're seeing here is due to interactions among those species, but we also know right now that the context for these interactions is changing, and it's changing really, really quickly. So things are warming up in Ohio and other places. Things are becoming more droughty, more intense drought events. And inversely, we're seeing more intense rainfall events. And that's changing life on Earth. And so this is sort of the lens we had historically looked at this climate change through, which is like thinking about individual species and what might be happening with those. And so we could think about where a species exists today, where those conditions are likely to be in the future, and where that species might be going. But of course, species are not existing in isolation, and there's all sorts of really important interactions that are happening. And we can think about some of those as being pests or pathogens in their hosts, pollinators and plants, plants and seed dispersers, predators and prey, and of course, competition. And I think competition provides a nice lens for us to think about like why climate change and interactions are such a complex sort of mix. So we can imagine a situation where we have these like birds and these small mammals, and they're all competing for these peanuts. And we could imagine that in isolation, the small mammal might do great with climate change, and the birds might do great with climate change. But if your birds that are trying to steal your peanuts are doing great, you might do less well than we would predict in isolation, right? So it complicates that picture. And at the same time as that's going on, we have really unprecedented levels of movement of species around the globe. And again, novel interactions. So species interacting now that never interacted before. And both of those factors, both non-native species and climate change, are reshaping what our communities look like. And they're reshaping how we might think about restoring them. So they both create or necessitate the need for restoration and then change the lens through which we think about what's going to work. And so we can put this in sort of a framework. And if I was smarter about technology, you'd think 2 years in, she would know. I would get rid of this black bar. Does anybody know how to do that?
Maybe more.
I'm going to mess it up. We'll leave it. So we know that climate structures communities. That's pretty well established. Species invasions also structure our communities, but climate really drives or sort of dictates how species are invading and what they're doing in their new communities. We can use restoration to sort of nudge these communities in directions we'd like to see them go. But the climate context that we do the restoration in is incredibly important for dictating or helping determine best practices in restoration. I'm going to try again now. I'm going to try not to shut it down. Hide video panel doesn't seem right, does it?
I think floating meeting controls down.
Just below.
There you go. Up.
Yep.
There you go.
This one?
Yeah. I think that one.
Yay. Okay. Teamwork, guys. So we're going to ask some questions here today. And we're going to ask and answer these in the context of California grasslands. And then we're going to talk a little bit about trees. So starting with, how might climate shape the potential for species interactions to structure communities? And then, how might climate shape the composition of restored communities via both site effects and year effects? And we'll define those in a minute. So we talked about competition as something that is really important in structuring communities, and this is, of course, true in plant communities. And I'd say this is particularly important like these early assembly phases. And I know some of you guys study community assembly. This is really thinking about these really incipient stages of communities where there's some like open space, open resources, and we're going to have lots of plants come in and duke it out to see who's going to hold the space. And you could say, like, how often are communities really assembling? Like, how often do we have new spaces opening up? And I would say at various spatial scales, it happens a lot. So we could imagine in a forest system, a single tree falls down and there's a light gap. And we're going to get lots of recruitment of seedlings into the light gap. They're going to duke it out. And at the end of the day, we're going to have one or two trees sort of hold that space when we look decades down the road. This happens on a larger scale in this neck of the woods and where I am in Ohio sort of all the time. We have lots of abandonment of agricultural land, reverting to old fields, new forests assembling on those lands. Disturbance is a big driver, so we can imagine a big fire, big flood, opening up new space. We can imagine some systems, these dynamics are playing out all the time, particularly systems that are dominated by lots of annual plants. And in the sort of world of assembly, there's a principle called priority effects. And this is really the idea that there's a benefit associated with early arrival. And so this is not different than humans and like donuts in the office. So I am somebody that gets in at 7:30, and so I'm always going to get the best donut. If you come at 10, you are probably not going to get the best donut. And the same is true in plant communities. So you could imagine if you get there early, you're going to get a leg up on everybody in terms of acquiring resources and getting good space. And so we could sort of watch this play out in fictitious space. So we could imagine two plots, and we're going to have those plots assembled by equal numbers of propagules of grasses and forbs or wildflowers. And in one case, we might imagine that we have our forbs and wildflowers, or forbs and grasses all arrive at the same time. And in the second scenario, we could imagine our wildflowers come first, and there's a little gap in time, and maybe that's 2 weeks, maybe that's a year, and then our grasses come. And so again, we have the same number of propagules, of these different species in our 2 plots, and we would let them grow for a few growing seasons. And we might imagine that we would have more wildflowers in space where wildflowers got priority. So, right, wildflowers came early, and now we have more wildflowers. But how are these communities sort of assembling in a real world, and particularly in one that's changing? And so here, back to the first question, how might climate shape the potential for species interactions to structure communities? There is precedent to believe that these interactions are really context dependent. So an example is work done by Paul Cardall. He looked at assembling plant communities in the greenhouse under high and low nutrient environments. And here on the y-axis, we're looking at dissimilarity of those communities. The more dissimilar they are, the more important priority effects are. And so we see that under high nutrient environments, priority effects are more important. So if you think about climate, Caroline Tucker and Tab Fukami did work with nectar yeast, so not with plants, looking at little yeast in these little nectar communities in the lab. And they looked at assembly and priority effects under really stable temperature conditions, and then more variable environments, so bigger fluxes in temperature, and found that, in fact, priority effects were generally weaker when temperature was more variable. And so how is this going to play out in a changing climate? And so when we think about species interactions outside in the field, modeling or looking at that under a changing climate can be a little bit difficult. There's lots of ways you can do it. So we could, for example, model those changes. Modeling could be nice if you are more computationally inclined than I am. It is computationally intense, tends to cost less. It can be difficult to insert a high level of realism in these sorts of models. You can manipulate climate in some way. You could do it passively or you could do it actively. This, of course, has a level of realism. It can be really expensive to do, and then can limit you in spatial scale. So it depends on what sorts of organisms you want to see interacting. We can look at sort of spatial gradients, so elevational or latitudinal gradients, and look at dynamics along those gradients to sort of make predictions about how things are going to respond to temperature changes in the future. Or we can look through time, thinking about, what interactions are happening across, changing climate and time. And so just as an example, this is mean annual temperature in Alaska from 1949 to 2014. And you can imagine if you were measuring an interaction through this time, you would be measuring it as temperature sort of steadily increased. But even if you weren't measuring it, if you just measured it in a few years, you could imagine that you might measure an interaction in, maybe 1994 when things were abnormally cold, and then again in 1998 when things were abnormally warm, and maybe you could make some inferences about how that interaction was responding to changing temperature or climate in some way. And so we'll ask, does climate influence the strength of interactions among species to shape communities? And we'll do this in the context of California grasslands. This is a sort of a large-scale mesocosm experiment. So these are aerial shots of the mesocosm, so you can see them from the sky, done in collaboration with Truman Young. And here we're going to use both space and time to sort of tease apart how climate and weather are really driving assembly in these communities. And so using 3 sites, sites at UC Davis, sites at McLaughlin Natural Reserve, and Hopland Extension. And then doing that identically through time. So assembling communities through time in 4 individual years. So we'll go through communities assembled in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, again, identically at each of 3 sites. And so we could look at what sort of spread in climate condition that might give us, or weather conditions specifically. So thinking about climate across space, here we're looking at 40-year averages of total precipitation and mean temperature for each of our 3 sites. So where those lines of a single color intersect, that's really the average climate for that space. So we can see here, Hopland is the coolest and the wettest of our 3 sites. McLaughlin sits in the middle. Davis is the hottest and the driest of the 3 sites. And so now we're going to look at what the conditions were like when we were actually assembling the communities. And so we'll overlay dots of each of these three colors. Anything that falls above the line means it was hotter than average. Anything to the left means that it was drier than average. So we're going to look for things above and to the left as sort of representative of future-ish climates. And so we can see that across the board, we're seeing generally hotter than average conditions, with the exception of the first year, 2011, which was a little bit cooler than average. And then everything is falling to the left of those lines, right? And this is not surprising. Like, California had been in a huge drought at this time, still is in droughty conditions. So what we're looking at is sort of reflective of what we're expecting for this space. So we assembled communities of 8 species. 4 of those were native grasses, and 4 of them were non-native grasses. The way we did this was to till these plots, wait for a flush of weeds, till them again to take those down, and then seed them by hand in these different combinations, 5 different combinations. Natives 1 year before exotics, native grasses alone, native and exotic grasses at the same time, priority, which was natives 2 weeks before exotics, and then the exotics alone at that sort of second time point. And today we'll just deal with 3 of them, and they'll be abbreviated. Natives alone, natives, exotics at the same time, and natives 2 weeks before exotics. And we looked at, percent cover of these species in the plots. So the first thing we wanted to do was just look at who's dominating the community. Is it natives or is it non-native species? And so here we'll look at the log ratio of natives to non-natives. 0 would be no difference, 50-50. 50% native, 50% exotic. These are going to be specifically the treatment where natives and exotics were sown at the same time. And so this is not surprising for the system, which is well known to be dominated at this point by non-native species. So all the time, exotic species dominated those systems. So all of our plots were dominated by non-native grasses. So the next thing we're going to do is look at the same ratio, the log ratio of natives to exotics, when we gave the natives a 2-week head start. So this is just 2 weeks. We sowed the natives. 2 weeks later, we sowed the non-native grasses. Again, 0 means no difference. Anything below that line means more exotics. Anything above would mean more natives. And so here, so the news isn't great, but it's a little bit better. So we don't get terrible, the numbers. Exotics are not dominating by as much. And now we get 2 instances where those communities came to be dominated by native species. And interestingly for us, they happened in different spaces and times, right? So it happened in Davis here in 2011, and it happened in Hopland in 2013. So it wasn't like we had a year that was going to promote a certain sort of grass. It was more idiosyncratic than that. We can look at this in a different way. So here we're going to look at just the percent cover of native grasses and looking across our 3 treatments, natives alone here. So we can see when we only sow the natives, they do pretty okay. Well, sometimes not so great, but they're doing the best that they can do. When we sow natives and exotics at the same time, they do really poorly. And when we give them a 2-week head start, which isn't all that much, they do significantly better. And we see that this is the 2011 planting across our 3 sites, but we see that through time. This pattern generally holds. And so we said, so we know that we have this sort of mosaic of different spaces and times giving us different starting weather conditions. Can we see what about the weather in a given year is going to make priority effects more or less important? And so we measured strength of priority as an effect size called Cohen's d. So we looked at mean cover of natives when they had priority minus when they didn't have priority over the pooled standard deviation. So we got Cohen's d. And we looked at our suite of weather conditions to say, can we predict that? Can we predict the strength of priority effects in the system based on something that's varying through space and time? And lo and behold, we could. So number of rainy days popped out in our models as the best predictor. So number of rainy days, as we got more rainy days, priority effects was more important. And and maybe in ecology, like this guy up here is not so happy for me, but this might be like the strongest trend I had ever seen. And this was, goodness, like the season in California, the wet season, it's all flipped. So we're collecting data in June. And so, like I'm pretty early bird, so I'm getting ready for ESA. And I've got my stuff, because the abstract is due. That's why I did it so early. I'm not that special. I just sort of pushed by the ESA abstract. So I analyzed these data, and I felt good about it. I submitted it. And then we collected new data in June. And that's where you should just not look at it right away. But we did. And I thought, boy, I'm going to put more points on this line, and it's going to be better. But it was not better. So we added that final year, and here they fell. And all of a sudden, number of rainy days was no longer a predictor of strength of priority effects. And okay, so this is more like what I'm used to seeing, so that wasn't super surprising. But what was surprising is that the reason it's not falling on the line anymore is because we have sort of high number of rainy days, but low priority effects. And living in California, I was like, this did not feel wet. It felt very dry to me. So we pulled up the weather data, just to look through our weather data coming in to make sure we weren't making some sort of mistake. So anybody that spent a lot of time in California, in the Central Valley, starts raining in the fall, usually late October, early November, and then it's going to rain through about May. And that was true. It started raining that year on Halloween, so October 31st, and then it rained almost every day through about Christmas. And after January 1st, it didn't rain another day. So we went from January through May, when it should have been pretty wet, to having absolutely no rain. And so this was a situation where we had a fair amount of rain, but in a totally aberrant pattern, which is reflective of the sort of patterns of precipitation we might expect with climate change, which is like boom and bust. We had a lot of rain, and then we had no rain, and it felt very droughty. And so the plants were responding to that, and that was making our trends sort of fall out of what we might have expected. And so we say, does climate influence the strength of interactions among species to shape communities? Sure does. Climate was influencing the strength of priority effects, but it was doing it in ways that were unpredictable under more extreme weather conditions. And so that's going to bring us to sort of a more applied side of things. We're going to ask, how might climate shape the composition of restored communities via site and year effects? And just to sort of like contextualize the last one, no restoration practitioner, no, this is not true. This is not a true statement. I was going to say no restoration practitioner is going to plant non-native grasses. They will plant non-native grasses. But lots of them will not. And so the one thing that is representative of, though, is that they will control non-native grasses. And how long are they going to control them for? So if they're going to pull them out, are they going to control them for 2 weeks? Are they going to control them for a year, only at the beginning? These are sorts of questions practitioners sort of think about. Practitioners are thinking about all sorts of other things. And so there's definitely a need to do restoration. Restoration can be costly, both in terms of money and time. And there's, unlike cancer research where there's lots of will to sort of like do it, restoration is sort of at the whim and discretion of people, right? So you've got them for a minute, they want to do restoration. When are you going to do the restoration? When are you going to spend that time and money to do that? And these are important questions practitioners have, in part because outcomes of restoration can be really idiosyncratic. And they sort of know that there's this whole suite of things that are going to influence their outcomes. So it's like, are you going to plant seeds or are you going to plant seedlings? Are you going to control non-native species? What sort of diversity seed mix are you going to use? And all of that is going to push your restoration in certain directions. But there's this really problematic thing, and people often sum them up as site effects and year effects, and that is really the idea that you can do identical restorations in different spaces and in different times, and you can get totally different results. And this can be really problematic because you might not get what you're looking for. And so we'll be back to California grasslands. This is a system where there's lots of need for restoration and conservation. This is a really imperiled system, in part because this part of the US is known as the salad bowl. So lots of the would-be grasslands are really, almond orchards and fields of lettuce and other things that we're consuming. And land is at a super high premium there. And then the remaining systems tend to be heavily invaded by annual grasses. And so we're going to look specifically at site and year effects in these systems. This is a sister experiment to the previous one. Totally different mesocosms, but in the same spaces. So same 3 sites, same 4 years. Instead of planting native and non-native grasses, now we're planting our same native grasses and 4 native wildflowers. And again, letting them grow through time and looking at cover of these species. And so here we're looking at 2015 data for mesocosms planted in 2011, 2012, 2013, and 2014. So these are our planting years at our 3 sites, Davis, Hopland, McLaughlin. And what you see like right off the bat is we get these big splits in what we're going to get. And so our wildflowers are in the shades of green, and our grasses are in the shades of orange. And we can see, half the time we're getting tons of wildflowers, and half the time we're getting tons of grass. And when we're getting grass communities, we're getting these sort of mixes that, are typically, dominated by Bromus carinatus. We're seeing lots of, and then when we're getting forb communities, we're mostly getting California poppy-dominated communities. But sometimes we get these really weird things popping up. So Hordeum brachiotherum here is dominating Hopland in 2011, but usually doesn't show up at all. So we're getting these widely disparate communities. And so all the grad students in the room know that you're never supposed to show data as pie charts. I do also know that. And I got a lot of flack for this, so I still show it because I think this is better than this. But let's put on our science glasses now, and we're going to look at it in science terms. And so this is showing us the same thing. So each of these is a mesocosm plot. Further apart dots are more different in community composition, and close dots are more similar. And so we can look, as an example, at, say, McLaughlin. So here we have 2011 McLaughlin, 2012, 2013, and 2014. So you can see these tight clusters based on when and where they were planted, really setting them up on these sort of different trajectories. And we can look at this in simpler terms. Again, we're going to look at log response ratio of forbs to grasses across space and time, 0 again. Equal proportion in forbs and grasses. Positive means more forbs, more negative means more grasses. And again, we get this split, and it's exactly what we see in our pie charts. Half the time, we're seeing grass-dominated communities, half in forb communities. Some years sort of trend in one direction. So 2011, big grass year. I have the power now. 2013, big forb year. And then the others are sort of split across space. See if I can do it again. This one? Boop. And so what is driving compositional differences in these communities? So we looked at this whole suite of environmental variables again. The big ones that we're pulling out in the model that are sort of pulling the community in different directions are, in that year of establishment, how many rainy days did we have? How many, or what was the mean annual temperature? Finding that wetter, cooler conditions were more favorable for our grasses than our forbs. And I will say, these were the parameters that popped out as being most important drivers, but they only explained about 40% of variability, right? So we know something, but clearly there's a lot going on that we don't yet understand. And so the other argument we could make was when we looked at the 2015 communities, in all the planting years, we could say all those plots were different ages, right? Maybe if we looked at them and they were all the same age, they would all be the same. So the other thing we did was look at the oldest plots, 2011, as measured in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, across our 3 sites. And so, because we're looking at pie charts, we're going to squint. But I don't think you have to squint very hard. And I will say the multivariate statistics play this out in our what is in the manuscript, because we are being in our science hat there. But so here I think what we see is there's quite a bit of shift across the first 2 growing seasons. And then after that, we're setting up communities that are pretty persistent through time. So what I think we're seeing is really divergent communities based on when they're established. And I'll say I'm working with a collaborator right now, Chaya Warner. So we continue to monitor these plots. And so now we're thinking about how having patches of different ages on the landscape are really setting up this mosaic that's contributing to beta diversity in ways that are really promoted by our native species and really sort of muted by our non-native species, which tend to turn over faster. And so there's this contribution to higher levels of biodiversity when we think about year effects and sort of dynamics that are parsing the landscape into these spaces that have established in different years. And so we ask, are restoration outcomes dependent on site and year effects? We see strong site and year effects that drive native cover and community composition in ways that we can sort of like grapple with, but that we don't still fully understand. And so back to that sort of initial framework, we know that climate is structuring communities, something we understand. Here we look a little bit more about how species invasion are structuring communities in ways that are really filtered through the lens of climate. And then think about restoration as a tool for pushing these communities to more desirable community compositions, but that also really being context dependent, like what are the conditions when you do the restoration that's really gonna set up where you're going. And then you say, but you came here from Ohio. And I say, yes, and I work in forests, but guess what? Trees, you guys know, are very slow. And so this is a section of the Holden Arboretum known as Stebbins Gulch. And it is it has a fancy designation by the federal government that I cannot remember the name of. But is a protected site, nice old growth forest. We can see here, this is in the spring, so these are lots of wild leek and other wildflowers. We have, these nice big trees, spaced pretty widely, and then shrubs and sort of subcanopy trees coming up in the understory. And this is sort of like one of our pride and joys. And this is a lot of what we have, and probably a lot of what you guys have in Michigan too. And so I call this sort of like the awkward teenage phase forest. And this is a forest we call the working woods. It's dominated mostly by red maple, sugar maple, and tulip poplar. And it is radically different. So this is, we're looking here at our maples that are really tightly spaced. This is a post-agricultural forest. It's about 60 years old. And so what we tend to get is these densely packed 60-year-old trees, right? They all came up in the same cohort. They're competing pretty intensely. And then on top of that, we get these really dense thickets in the understory. This is multiflora rose. This is one of our big deal non-natives. And then glossy buckthorn, which is our other big deal non-native there. So I know you guys have barberry. We have some of that. We also have some privet, some honeysuckle. But these are our big two. And so these are our awkward teenage forests. And they're what we grapple with and what lots of Ohio and probably lots of Michigan are grappling with too. And so my research now, in part, is asking, can we go from like the awkward teenage phase to the stately old growth phase in maybe less than 400 years? Like, can we help that along on this process and maybe not get stuck in this sort of cycle that we get here with these exotics in the understory? And so we have teamed up with our conservation department and our local Ohio State foresters to do some just really basic land management on our lands and see if we can quantify the changes that that's going to bring about. And so what we've been doing, by we, I mean our like brilliant conservation team that is much better with a chainsaw than I. I'm not even a little bit competent with a chainsaw. But so they've come in and they've girdled trees. So one of the things these young forests don't have, that old forests have, is like old trees that got old and died. And that's an important wildlife habitat feature. So these guys come in and they girdle about 20% of our canopy trees. And the fear is if we sort of release resources, make light gaps, but we don't reckon with our thicket of non-natives in the understory? Are we just going to like release those resources to grow bigger thickets of exotics in the understory? And so the team also is removing in half of the plots all of the exotic shrub layer. And they're doing that as by a mix of cutting and then using herbicides on them. And so this is neither here nor there, but this is sort of an aerial of this space. And only to say that, we have these plots, but we've cut them in half, and we've implemented our restoration in each of 2 years, so in 2018 and in 2019. And when I say forests are slow, trees grow slow, but guess what? They die really slow too. And maybe that's super obvious, but all our girdle trees, they're putting out leaves every year. And so we think in the next 2 years they are likely to kick the bucket. But we are still working on that. And so we've done this in 2 years, and then we are working on top of that. So the idea behind that is that we will capture different climate conditions for our management and see if that sets our forests on different trajectories. We're then trying to overlay some through fall manipulations so we can change levels of precipitation, make some areas wetter and some areas drier in our forests to see how that is going to influence what's coming up. And so as we're doing these management practices, we are really intensively monitoring the growth of our trees, the remaining canopy trees. How fast are those guys growing? How productive are our forests? And then what does the next generation look like? So what is happening in that seedling layer? Who's coming up? Who's living? Who's dying? Who's growing fast? And is that different dependent on when we did the management work and what those climate conditions are like in that space? And so I think when we think about these sorts of dynamics, we're thinking about restoration, and it's like restoration ecology is still a field that is really in need of a more predictive framework. And so as we think as ecologists, what we can be doing, there's lots of folks out there that are doing this sort of restoration work. So thinking about teaming up with them and quantifying the outcomes of their restoration, but also thinking about really purposefully applying restoration so that we can maximize inference that we get from these sorts of systems, because there's so much time, money, and labor going into them. And they're really ripe at this point for building a database that is going to make restoration a more predictive field. And so with that, I'll thank all the folks that I've worked with throughout my career and some of the funders. And I'd be happy to take any questions. I think they're like big boxes. Got it.
The box is ready.
Thank you, Katie. That was great. I was wondering, just looking at your data from California and what a role that rainy days play. So is one of the keys to restoring an area how you want it to look is just to water it a ton? And if you don't water it a ton, is it going to go spiraling? Because it seems like it's becoming more droughty. So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, and I think like in a lot of like this is where working with a conservation group is nice, right? In that like level of realism, what would a practitioner do? And in a lot of cases, it's probably not a realistic ask. Mm-hmm. So I think it's like thinking purposefully, if you know kind of like what you're aiming for, thinking about like, is this El Nino or La Nina, or like what broad climate conditions are we expecting for the next year? And if we can only do this once, is this our year? So I would think more about, timing things and trying to fit in with nature.
So you're carrying that forward to the work you're doing at Holden?
Yeah, so that is our drivers are probably different here, right? Mm-hmm. This is a really wet system. And so thinking about what are the drivers in that system where I think we don't really have a good sense. And in fact, it feels like too wet is maybe more of an issue where we are. And so thinking about what conditions are we looking for? And right now we're still trying to grapple with, what do we think is optimizing what we're doing? And we don't really have a good clue yet. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Lovely, lovely talk, Katie. I wondered what role fire might play.
Yeah, so this is not a system that I think would have burned a whole super ton, probably similar to Michigan, where those return intervals, I'm not actually, what is the return interval here? Not all that frequent. Yeah. Yeah, and so they do use it. This is it's a forested system, but we maintain old fields, and sometimes they burn those, and sort of like outside of what a natural regime would be here, but to manage non-natives, because these are inherently sort of not natural systems anyways,
Yep.
that are maintained for various wildlife.
Can I ask one more question since
Yeah.
I'm holding the cube? About those pie charts.
Love them. Not loving them.
We can talk about those later too, maybe. I think I misunderstood it until the very end. So those weren't data from those years that you were tracking. Those were plots
Establishment
that were,
years.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Got it. I need to look at that again then.
Yeah.
Got it.
Sorry.
Thank you. Anyone? I really want to toss it to someone. Oh, perfect. Yes.
No.
Hey yo. So you're doing the restoration work in the Cleveland area. Sorry, I forget the name of it. And you're restoring towards in the trajectory of the old growth that you showed the picture of, the really beautiful forest. My question is sort of why?
Yeah, well, for a few reasons. And so in part, they tend to be more biodiverse, they tend to be more productive, and so like lots of the services that we might want to have in a forest in terms of both harboring diversity but also sequestering carbon and doing all sorts of things like that, that's more in the direction that we in general would like to see it go. And it is also where we think it would be if we hadn't like bumped in and like, cut down all the trees and had agriculture. And so we've sort of spun it off in this direction that's less biodiverse and harboring lots of non-natives in ways that we think might not be optimal for lots of sort of functioning purposes.
And so do you have are there like certain functions you're focusing on that you want to sort of capture that you can measure over time? So like carbon sequestration, you could actually maybe argue that the old growth is going to be sequestering less carbon. I don't know these forests, but I mean that's common. So like is that?
Yeah, I suspect there's a sweet spot in the middle, not where we're sitting now and maybe not in the total old growth phase, but that phase where we're going to get those trees to grow a little bit faster and get more sort of dynamic things happening in the understory and more generations coming up. And so that's the other thing we think about. And in part because right now in Ohio, but in lots of spaces, these low diversity forests tend to be really vulnerable because of the emergence of lots of novel pests in our region. And so when we have a forest dominated by 3 species, that's a really vulnerable forest, both because of pests and because of their potential tolerance for changing climate. And so we think of more diverse forests as being just more resilient to future disturbances and changes. And so that's one of the things that we're going for in those systems.
Cool, thanks. I'm going to kick it. Can I kick it?
She's coming for it.
Don't even throw it.
Oh, no. Yeah, so your experiment in the forest is like where you're removing the trees, like making them die. It's quite interesting, but thinking through the invasive species perspective, like when you give all this light to the forest and then there are a bunch of invasive species there that you're also treating, what is the expectation for the native species? Like, are you expecting them to come in? Are you going to put them there? Like, is there like any leverage for experiment or something like that?
Yeah, so it's a mix. So some native species, yes, especially native woody things are coming in. When we think about our native forbs, our herbaceous layer, that is much slower to recover. And so we are doing some work to reintroduce aspects of that in sort of purposeful ways because they are not. And for long periods of time, when we look at our land use history gradient at the Arboretum, we can have stuff that was abandoned and looks pretty nice, and it's maybe been around for 100+ years, but we don't see that layer. It won't it seems like in the time scale that I have to look at it, it's not going to come back. And so we're doing purposeful restoration of that. One of the things that's a little bit different from the perspective a lot of you guys will take in your research is as a public-facing institution, the plots are also public demonstration sites. So I come in and say, let me quantify these things, but Forest Service comes in with landowners and says, this is what it could look like if. It's like going to IKEA. Here's what your kitchen could look like. Here's what your forest could look like if you thinned it. Here's what it could look like if you also managed the understory. And so we do more of that also with things like medicinal plants or, growing mushrooms or things like that because we need to inspire people to think about their own forest. And so we have a lot of that, and heavy on the end that would be of interest to people, but some, just regular sort of wildflowers too.
Thank you.
Questions, Katie. So let's thank you again for.
Yeah, thanks for my first talk back.